What are the new emerging technologies in market research? And where should your focus be over the next 2 years? So in this presentation today, I'm going to talk about 3 levels of new technology: the mainstream technologies, things that are really here, things that are bubbling along nicely and you should be aware of, and some things which are clearly niches. I nearly said only niches, but actually that's unfair because sometimes a niche can be really useful. There's not been much change over the last 3 to 4 years, so I'm going to talk about why there has been that stability, a little bit about the key drivers of change in the market research industry, and then some tips. Now, most of what I'm going to tell you today is drawn on the latest GRIT report that was published less than a month ago. It collected data in November and December. It's a global study. However, it's a future-focused study. It's a forward-looking study. Not everybody in the whole world takes part in the GRIT study. It tends to be people who are interested in new technologies, new changes, and so on. So that is a fairly systematic bias. What we're looking at is, where is the industry going? And I think for this sort of study, that's fine, but we should bear that in mind. It's a good sized study, over 1,500 people, and over 300 of those are buyers of market research, and that's useful too. So the main message, and you're going to be aware of this, is that mobile is really mainstream. So we used to have mobile surveys as one of the techniques in the study, and it had reached the point where 75% of people saying, yes, that's already in use. So we switched this year to mobile first surveys, and 50% of people are claiming they're doing mobile first surveys. We think they're by and large wrong. We think they're pressing, in many cases, the mobile optimize button and not looking at some of the differences, because when we talk to the panel companies, when we talk to the people providing the software platforms, they are saying over half of the surveys are not actually friendly for mobile phone users. So there is a bit of a mismatch there, but certainly people are intending to be mobile. And about 30 to 40% of all the surveys completed around the world are completed on mobile devices. That number is much higher if you are not contacting a sample company. If you are contacting your own customer database, you are likely to find much higher percentages are coming in through the mobile devices. And we also see strong elements of mobile qualitative and mobile ethnography. And one of the really exciting rapid developments is in the area of video apps. So the Vox Pop Me's, the Watch Me Thinks, and all of these other tools that are coming in, and the built-in tools in the platforms. So clearly mobile, very mainstream. Online communities have been growing strongly, and that really is the result of 3 factors in general. So online communities, sometimes they're short-term communities, maybe 3 days, 3 weeks, a month, or they're long-term communities, and they all share these benefits. The first is focusing on customers instead of markets, making the customer central to your thinking and your processes is one of the key drivers behind the online communities. The second is related to that, which is co-creational, being able to work with people as we realize there are more smart people outside your organization than inside, and longitudinal. So even if it's a 3-week project, you're looking to learn things during those 3 weeks and evolve. If the project, the online community, has been running for 10 years, as is the case with many communities now, then there is a massive longitudinal learning which can be achieved. If we look at those long-term communities, the 3 big drivers about those communities are speed. You could do the research faster. You can get a request this afternoon and deliver the results tomorrow morning. Cost. It has got really low costs for one more study. Typically, you can do 3 times as much research for the same budget. And concerns about panel quality. If you've got your own online community, you know who is in it. You can take care of the quality issues yourself. Now let's have a look at some of those bubbling issues. And the first one I'm going to look at is text analytics. So amongst the forward-looking agencies and researchers, just under half say they're doing some form of text analytics. and it's really varied. So obviously a lot of social media. Initially that meant sentiment analysis, positive, negative, neutral, but it's moving a long way beyond that now. Voice of the customer. Now that includes analyzing emails, analyzing letters, analyzing telephone calls that have been transcribed into text so we can interpret the meanings. It means the 1 and 2 questions. At the moment in the United States, they're very popular, for example, with Tom Anderson, who was doing these sorts of questions. So they're coalescing a little bit with the microservice idea. Integrated with automated transcription. So people are beginning to turn tape recordings or digital recordings and video recordings into text. And once we do that, we can run text analytics. And there's some really interesting stuff. And you're going to see more about that coming from Europe, about looking at automating text analytics and semiotics and long texts. So articles, blog posts, finding out what is the essence that people are writing about. Now, another couple of techniques that I've grouped together for a reason you'll see in a moment in this bubbling along are the social media analytics, which trickles along to just under half of the people completing our survey saying they're doing it, and big data analytics, which is reaching the point of getting on for 40%. So that is interesting. But at that point, they would be in the halfway land between a niche and bubbling along strongly. But if we split the data by buyers and suppliers, we see something quite scary. These are mainstream techniques for the buyers of market research, but they're not mainstream techniques for the things that the market research companies are selling. The reason for that is a lot of this stuff is being bought from non-market research suppliers. That is clearly a major worry and a major threat to the future of traditional market research. We need to get to grips with that difference. Now, there's a bunch of techniques here which have all made some interesting ground: the micro surveys, the super short surveys, behavioral economics, research gamification, and prediction markets. So all of them in their own right are doing some interesting things. But maybe their biggest impact is that they are changing the way ordinary research is being done. So we're seeing behavioral economics and research gamification changing the design of standard surveys. We look at what the likes of the Lightspeeds and the SSIs are doing, and it's not actually adopting these as mainstream techniques. It's learning from them to change what they are doing. And quite often, the importance of emerging technology or an emerging approach is the way it changes the way we do our existing business, as opposed to creating new businesses. More of an evolutionary route. And then we have some which are niche by nature: eye tracking, applied neuroscience, facial analysis, crowdsourcing, virtual environments, perhaps is the best example, which has declined from 2014 to 2017. Now, Steve Nadell has got a great presentation later this week where he has been talking about what he's learned from the last 25 years of doing virtual reality research. It's not actually a new technology. Eye tracking is not an incredibly new technology, but it's got much better. VR has got much better. Facial analysis, and based on Paul Ekman's work, it's relatively new, but it's not brand new. And what we're seeing with all of these is they tend to be limited by 3 factors. First is specificity. They tackle some problems really well, but they don't tackle all the problems. They're by and large not customer satisfaction, brand tracking, market measurement, all of these sorts of things. They tend to be around ideation, concept evaluation, ad testing, these sorts of areas. So the specificity means they're good at something, but they're not general tools, and that's going to make them a niche. Many of them have a much bigger setup time, or it takes more effort, or it takes more cost to set them up. That holds them back because one of the biggest drivers for clients is speed. The second biggest driver is cost. If you have a problem that requires virtual reality, great, you will do it. But if you have a problem that would be solved slightly better by using virtual reality, Are you willing to give up on the extra time to create the store layout, the environment, the test materials, and so on? Not necessarily compared with a straightforward approach, a survey that's learned from prediction marketing and behavioral economics and gamification and can be turned around in a couple of days. Because when techniques generate marginal gains, they almost never become mainstream. Something has to actually be replacing a failure before you say, yes, I'm going to spend time and money, and it's in that order, time and money, in order to be able to move forwards. And then we have some things which I would say are not ready for prime time. Internet of Things, biometric response, the whole telemetry issue, wearables. And there's a couple of really key issues for us to grasp. They're asking us to trade off good precision versus poor coverage. And occasionally that is going to be fantastically useful. But a lot of the time, good precision does not beat poor coverage, does not compensate for poor coverage. So that is one of the key problems there. And the second, and this is really why techniques like Google Glasses didn't take off more strongly. Something only works in the insights market research world if you can integrate it into the process. That's why Tobii Glass has done so much better in terms of eye tracking than many of its competitors. That is why the Watch Me Thinks and these new video tools are doing so much better than the earlier ones, because they are integrated. What we need to see with the Internet of Things and the biometric responses and the telemetry and wearables is much better integration with existing market research processes. It's not enough to say we have a new solution, because occasionally that will make you super relevant. But if you want to be bigger than that, you've got to integrate with the processes so that you can add to what is already being done. So, stability. Now, for those of you who are looking at those charts quickly, and of course you'll be able to download them later and have a look at them at your leisure, or you can download the grit reports and have a look at them at your leisure, you'll notice that there was very little difference over those 4 years, 2014, 15, 16, 17. The average increase on those items that were in all 4 years was 3%. Over the 4 years, less than 1% a year. The average change over the last 12 months was actually -1. The usage got less in the last 12 months on average. So why is that happening? Innovation goes in waves. We have a burst of innovation, and then we have trial, and then we have implementation. And what happens in implementation is some of the things you tried, you drop. So you have more people doing something during trial, but less during implementation. And we've had a great discussion with the board looking at the grit study, and what we're going to see in the future is an addition which allows us to talk about using it more and using it less, as opposed to just using it. And we expect to find some very interesting information in that. The linkage into mainstream research, which I was just talking about, that can be quite slow. It took quite a long time for eye tracking to become more integrated. It took really probably 12, 15 years before companies started turning up with really good video tools that integrated into the research pattern in a strong way. So the new stuff has got to integrate into the insights ecosystem. They don't have to integrate into the market research ecosystem, but it's good for them if they do. But they've at least got to integrate into the insights ecosystem. If they just sit there in NPD and they're not linked through to sales and marketing and the rest of it, they don't have the impact. And that slows down this rate of change. And of course, and this is the scary one, we may not be growing the use of these tools, but maybe there are non-market research companies delivering solutions to non-insight teams using some of these new tools. The key drivers of change. So if we're trying to understand what drives change, the first one, overwhelmingly for the last, probably since the rise of CATI, certainly through the rise of online surveys, has been speed. The speed of business is getting faster and faster and faster. And nearly right now is so much better than perfect but late, because perfect but late is useless. And so there is this real emphasis on speed. The second one, of course, is cost, and this is not new. It has been going on forever, and in most markets. So if you can buy something that you consider to be good enough at a lower price, you will buy it at the lower price. We're seeing more and more tools like automation coming in, which is making things faster, but it's also creating downward cost pressure. If you can provide a missing link, so people know they have a problem, they can't solve that problem, and then all of a sudden you come along with an answer to it, that is fantastic. So we had a missing link discovered many years ago when brand tracking was invented, largely by Maurice Millward and Gordon Brown in Warrington in the UK. Companies knew they needed to audit their advertisers. It gave them a method of auditing their advertisers. Big jump forward. Customer satisfaction. Big jump forward. NPS, I want a one number solution, even if it isn't great, was a known problem in the research and the insights industry, and it came in and did that. So if you've got a missing link, you can be slower and you can cost more than the alternatives because people can't do it any other way. And finally, the last driver is quality. If you can do something which is safer, better, it doesn't cost more, it doesn't take longer, then actually people will do it, providing it doesn't take too much effort. So quality is down that bottom end of the scale. However, there are always some buyers. The people who buy from the best consultancies, the people who put in the extra amount of time, are the ones that buy that quality. So whilst as a generalization, it's the last category, there are buyers out there who you can find. They will never be a mass market, but they're certainly fun to work with. So what do I think is coming next? Here are the emerging technologies. I've shown you the mainstream, the bubbling along technologies, but what about next? Well, I was talking about it all of last year. We've got a great panel discussion on Friday with Lenny Murphy and Kristen Lurk and Melanie Courtrain, and you're going to hear a lot about automation. Automation is changing our industry. It's making it faster, it's making it cheaper, it's making it more consistent, which is one version of quality. So you're going to hear a lot more about automation this year. More and more video. So last year was a year of video breakthrough. The year before was a year of video breakthrough. And this year is going to be even more video breakthrough. It's very interesting to see Karina's last presentation where we saw the 8-second video. Artificial intelligence, it's not going to make a massive difference in 2018. You will start to see it coming in, and it's going to come in at lots of different entry points. So in the predictive analytics, the really complicated hard stuff, you are going to see some artificial intelligence. You're going to see it come in more of the reporting. You're going to see it coming in more of the project design. We're going to see the growth of more and better chatbots. We're also going to see it applied inside video and text analytics. Not necessarily visible, although there'll be a lot of discussion about things like machine learning, natural language processing. Probably, if I were looking 5 years down the line, then artificial intelligence is going to have a bigger impact than anything except automation. So my top tips to you. Short-term changes are often overestimated. When people tell you that this is going to change the industry today, they are wrong. You look at how long it took online surveys to change the industry, really 8 to 10 years. It was a massive change, but it takes time. Look at how long it took for CATI to become the dominant data collection method in North America, about 10 years, and it never did in the rest of the world. So often those are overestimated, but the long-term changes are often underestimated. 15 years ago, most people were only surveyed twice a year. After that, they were ruled as ineligible. Now, most research around the world is done with panel companies. People are doing 100 surveys a year. That is a fundamental change, and it itself has helped generate the online communities movement. Innovations to be successful have to be faster and cheaper to replace previous solutions. If they're not faster and cheaper, they are not going to replace it. Better almost never cuts it. But niches can be really useful. If we take VR, it's a very profitable business for those people who do it well. For those clients who need it, it's fantastic. Eye tracking when you need it is fantastic. So niches isn't really a dirty word. You just need to make sure that you understand how to make money out of the niche. New tools need to integrate with the Insights ecosystem to deliver consistent value. If somebody comes to you with a great new R-based dashboard that will link 2 or 3 types of telemetry data together, that is interesting, but it's only useful if you and your clients can put it into the business process. It's got to take business needs, integrate with the insights process, and generate business actions. It doesn't matter how clever it is. If it doesn't do those, it's not going to be relevant. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you for enjoying the first day of the festival. And Betty, do we have any questions?
We do indeed, Ray. Hello, and thank you very much for a great presentation looking at the future and things we should look out for now. We've got a couple of questions actually from Susan Petayan. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that surname correctly. Who is asking, how big is the buyer market that cares a lot about quality versus, for example, speed, and is that quantifiable?
I don't know if it's quantifiable, so I'm going to give you my gut instinct, which is that the research industry globally is worth about $44 billion. There's probably $2 billion worth of people who are really motivated by quality. And sometimes that will be by individual inside a company. So maybe an organization is mostly driven around speed and it's mostly driven around cost, but there might well be an insight buyer, and I can think of insight buyers that I've worked with who really stand up and say, no, I want quality, I demand quality. However, they can be really tough, because one of those people I'm thinking of would be Vanessa Ashima in Japan, and she was very quality focused. However, she also drove a fairly hard bargain. I say was because she's now on the supplier side, not because she's not in the industry anymore. But for a long time, she was on the buyer side. She drove a really hard bargain about speed and cost. Just because a client is quality focused doesn't mean they give up on being hard around those other issues. It's just that they do have that quality focus.
Right, okay, Ray, and yes, thank you very much for making that clear. I'm sure a lot of other listeners are nodding their heads feverishly there. So another question from Susan. What has more impact in change, in the rate of change in market research? Is it the buyer side or the provider side, in your opinion, Ray? And also if you've got any maybe insight on that from research reports.
I have a very strong view on that, and it is mostly buyer, but they don't always realize it. So quite often when you're with a group of research buyers, they will complain about the limited number of global companies that they're able to choose from, the Ipsos, GfKs, Kantars, and so on. But they created it by the way they configured their bidding processes, by the choices they made in terms of saying, we want the same agency to supply this in these X countries, we want this sort of support mechanism. Probably very sensible choices, but they created that process. NPS is another good example. It's really quite a flawed measure. It's not a terrible measure. It's got some positive correlations with running the company better, but it's nothing like as strong a measure as it is sometimes made out to be. But clients have latched onto it with absolutely a lockjaw approach because it delivers that one number, that simplicity that the CFO and the C-suite are looking for. So to use an old phrase about God and religion, actually, agencies propose and clients dispose.
Right, okay. Thank you for answering that, Ray, and I hope that answers your question, Susan. A quick question from me, Ray, before we move on to some of the other queries we've had through. Now, inevitably, when we talk about new methodologies that drive new technologies, or in some cases vice versa, we can't help but talk about market research skills. So when we're talking about, when you mention things like gamification, of course, there's a whole new skill set there in terms of user experience and even understanding game design, same thing for virtual reality and so on and so forth. So in terms of looking at the future, Ray, what do you think are the top sort of 2 or 3 skills you think researchers need in order to be ready for some of the predictions you've mentioned?
The first skill is a reasonably good understanding of business. You need to know the nature of business. It's not enough to be a research methodologist anymore. So why do businesses make these sorts of decisions? How do they make their money? How does marketing work? Who are the C-suite? What is the connection between decision-making processes? Then the second one would be a general knowledge about the way questions work. And that, of course, has evolved because of things like behavioral economics, but a reasonable understanding of that, which is based more in psychology than anywhere else. And then the third one is you want to be good at something. So the T-shaped employee, so that the bar on the T is general research. Business knowledge, everybody should have it. Basic research savvy of quant and qual, everybody should have it. But then you should be a real expert in something you find interesting. So that could be ethnography, that could be conjoint analysis, that could be cross-cultural studies, that could be gamification, that could be visualization. It really doesn't matter. Find something and become an expert in it. And then if you really want to get to the top, when I see the people who do really well, they became an expert in one topic by the time they were 25, and a second topic by the time they were 28, and a third one by the time they were 31. And so by the time they got to be senior managers and execs, they actually had several really strong strings to their bow. And that's a good way. So don't think about becoming an expert in something as an endpoint. Particularly in the way the world is changing, you need to move forward, partly because the area you're becoming an expert in could be automated in a few years' time.
Indeed, indeed. But before that happens, we'll follow Annie's advice and write a book about the thing that we've become an expert in. So a couple more questions, Ray, if we've got the time. So one here from John Morton, who is saying, regarding text analytics, what about actual pure voice analytics?
Well, I'm sitting here.
That's a whole new presentation there. But
like a lot of people, I'm sitting here at home and I can't go, hey, and then the name of a famous company, because it will turn on my voice recognition system and will turn my lights on and off, or the heating on and off, and so on. That stuff is already happening around us. Anybody who is running Alexa, my system's not Alexa, so I can say their name safely, realizes that that is not voice recording, that is voice recognition. So voice recognition is going to change things in terms of how we collect information and how we interact. In terms of the big analytics, however, it will be turned into text, just as a lot of video stuff will be turned into hypertext descriptive languages, so you can run the really big analytical engines on them to find out what are the underlying messages, what are the common themes and patterns. So we are going to see a growth in voice analytic interpretation, but we will also see voice to text, and that will get better and better. And voice to text is already scarily good. For those of you who run a Mac, just turn on the dictation tool and you'll be amazed at how clearly that turns what you speak into written material. So all of this stuff is happening around us and will happen more and more as we move forward. Particularly important in working with videos, where what we need and what we're beginning to get are pieces of software that will turn all the voice into text. They're not very good at who said it, however, yet, and turn the visuals into simple tag descriptions: breakfast, people, eating, glasses, and things like this, so that we can then work in a wider range of ways with that information.
Right. And what this actually segues slightly onto Susan's third question, where she was just saying that she was surprised to see passive monitoring was not included in your presentation. But given what you were just saying, Ray, do you have any thoughts or predictions about this as a, in quotes, new area?
I think to some extent it's in there in the sensor data telemetry. So it depends on the type of passive data, because social media analytics and big data both use quite a lot of passive data. Quite often when we talk about passive data, we're narrowing the definition down, and so far there's been a lot of difficulty of integrating it into the Insight ecosystem, or some surprising problems. I saw a great presentation from a German transport study, and they'd been keeping these paper diaries of people taking journeys, and people wrote down, I caught a bus, I traveled 3 kilometers, the weather was like this, and the purpose of the journey was so on. So they decided to use smartphones as an experiment, and in lots of ways it was good, because of course the smartphone, you got home, the smartphone said, right, you've done 3 journeys today, can you add some notes please about why did you do this journey, and so on. However, their most surprising finding was that the number of journeys was smaller on the smartphone than it was on the paper data. And the reason for that in this study was that the app they were using turned itself off when they reached 20% battery level. And a lot of people have their phone going down to 20% battery level a lot of the time. So it was only recording journeys when the battery was there. Now, we will get around those problems. But we need to get around those problems and integrate the information and deal with some of the concerns that we're going to have over the general data privacy regulations that are coming in May this year in Europe, in order to be able to do that. So passive will be enormous, but it has to integrate with the business and insights ecosystem in order to be able to do that.
Right, thank you very much, Ray. I'm not sure if we've got time for any more questions. We don't have any more from the GoToWebinar platform. But just a final question from me, Ray, which I think might wrap things up quite nicely. Now, often in market research, there is a new methodology, a new technology, and it's very easy to get excited and almost jump on a bit of a bandwagon. Do you have a process, whether that's an informal sort of thought process or something that you do a bit more proactively, that makes you see into the future of actually, is this really going somewhere, or is this going to be a little bit of a, you know, famous for 5 minutes sort of thing?
Well, there are 2 or 3 things, and I'm taking Annie's hint, perhaps I should write these up a bit more, but one of the ones is, how scalable is it? So does it depend on people who are skillful? Because if it depends on people who are skillful, there is a limit to how big it can be. So real ethnography is fantastic, but it requires ethnographers. Facial coding, unless you automate it, requires people who have been taught to facial code, really time consuming. So there are obviously limits that way. Does it require hardware, technology and setup? How easy is it for the client to use? So if we want to use something and they've got to create 3-dimensional images of the products they want to test, that's actually hard work for them. So that limits us back. But one of the tests I will often apply when I'm talking to a startup is say to them, well, if your product was free, how successful do we think it will be? Who would get to hear about it? So if you had a brand tracker that was free, you would have to convince people to put in all the time and resource and effort to try you out. They might do that, but they might not, depending on how much time and effort. And how would you get to meet the people who were going to make that decision? Because people only decide to change their brand tracker at most once every 12 months. So asking the question, what would happen if it was free, can often be a really useful thought exercise in seeing what would need to happen for this to become a successful product.
Right, Ray, thank you very much. And yeah, really good thoughts there. So next time there is some sort of fad, people getting on a bandwagon, recommendations for everybody to apply those thought processes. Is it scalable and so on? So thanks, Ray. Back over to you, as I believe you have some closing notes.